I should apologize to start off with, because what I'm going to do in the next hour is really worry in public. And worrying in public is not always a pretty sight, and it doesn't always necessarily lead to an entertaining presentation. But it is hugely useful for me, because it gives me an opportunity to, if like, think through a series of problems that I see rising on the agenda, and think through what I think about them. But before I get on to that, I really just want to say thanks for the invitation to speak here and to speak to you. And before I get stuck into that worrying in public, I did just want to take a moment to reflect on the wider project we're here to both celebrate and share. Because in my experience, it's unique. With a budget the size of a tuppenny bit, the BL, through the labs, is both intervening in a space few others have had the confidence to inhabit, and as importantly, gently interrogating the role of a library, in this case, the library, in a changing world of information and discovery. By reaching out to both humanist scholars in need of technical support and expertise, and as importantly, developers keen to pursue an idea with an academic or humanist twist, the lab is working in a space that neither the academy and higher education nor the private sector are particularly good at. The lab creates a space in which the intellectual capital of the library is made available to its users in an entirely new way. There are any number of research council initiatives, of European funding calls, of twitchy private sector startups out there, ragging at the edge of established practice. We are advised to seek disruption and to pursue the shiny. But it's important to remember that the institutions we've inherited, libraries and museums in particular, were created in service of a deeper purpose. It's not simply that we value them because they're ancient and august. Instead, we value them as a means of preserving memory and acknowledging worth. And as importantly, we value them as a part of a complex ecology of knowledge discovery, dissemination, and reflection. So while disruption and the shiny are all good, it remains important that libraries continue to serve the fundamental purposes for which they were created, and that the lab, it seems to me, is an answer to that need in many respects. In other words, as much as being a space in which new projects and approaches can be bench tested, the lab is important as a fragment of an ongoing negotiation about the role of the institutions of memory and knowing. And getting that role right is imperative. By acknowledging the existence of the library's own great technical expertise, and essentially inviting people from across the piece to partner with it, the lab is effectively rethinking what it is to be a reference librarian, an information professional, an engineer servicing a technology of knowing. Over the course of the rest of today, you will see wild and fun initiatives roll before your eyes. But as they do, I think it's worthwhile keeping in mind that larger project and aspiration of turning this inherited institution, the British Library, into something that can continue to deliver on the unchanging principles it was created to serve. That's my pitch for the lab. It's important, and it is an overall good thing. And it should, what it is doing is simply unique within the field as far as I know, and the outcomes look ever better. But while I have you all here, I also want to spend the next few minutes worrying in public at a different issue, and to mull over what seems to me an increasingly central aspect of the growing infrastructure of knowing that is emerging from several different quarters. As data gets big, as our ability to store, curate, and interrogate ever larger bodies of material grows ever more powerful, and here I think of the BL's own role in digital deposit, it strikes me that we're increasingly faced with a profound issue of scale, and that many people have been responding to the conundrums of size by simply looking for big data and forgetting about small data. What I want to do in the next few minutes is look briefly at a subset of what I feel to be important emerging strategies for information and information interrogation, and to go a step beyond that to look at what's lost by focusing on the very large without simultaneously thinking about the very small. And the place I need to start is with the emergence of what feels to me like an increasingly commonplace label, a macroscope, for a core aspiration of a lot of people working in the digital humanities in particular. As far as I can tell, the term macroscope was coined in 1969 by Piers Jacob, and I would not suggest anybody go out and read his books. But he did use it as the title of his science fiction and fantasy work of the same year, in which the macroscope, a large crystal, able to focus on any location in space-time with profound clarity, is used to produce something like a telescope of infinite resolution. In other words, a way of viewing the world that encompasses both the minuscule and the massive. The term was also taken up by Joel de Rosnay and deployed as the title of a provocative, can there be a provocative book on systems analysis? I think there is, but in 1979. And the label has also had a long and undistinguished afterlife as a trademark for a suite of project management tools, a methodology suite supported by the Jiu-Jitsu Corporation. But I think that the starting point for interest in the possibility of creating a macroscope for the digital humanities comes out of computer science and the work of Katie Berner from around 2011. Her designs and advocacy for the development of what she describes as a plug-and-play macroscope seem to have popularized the idea to a wider group of digital humanists and developers who have gradually been working at the edges of this. To quote Berner, macroscopes provide a vision of the whole, helping us synthesize the related elements and detect patterns, trends, and outliers while granting access to myriad details. Rather than make things larger or smaller, macroscopes let us observe what is at once too great, too slow, or complex for the human eye and mind to notice and comprehend. In other words, for Berner, a macroscope is a visualization tool that allows a single data point to be both visualized at scale in the context of a billion other data points and drilled down to its smallest compass. This was not a vision or project initially developed in the humanities. Instead, it was a response to the conundrums of big data in both STEM academic disciplines and the wider commercial world of information management. But more recently, there have been a series of macroscope projects that have begun to emerge from within the humanities, tied to their own intellectual agendas, and subtly recreating the idea with a series of distinct humanist emphases. And perhaps the project most heavily promoted recently is a thing called Paper Machines, which was created by Joe Gouldy and Chris Johnson Robertson and the Met Lab at Harvard. And it forms a series of visualization tools built to work with Zotero, which is an online citation service, and ideally allowing the user to both curate a large-scale collection of works and explore its characteristics through space, time, and word usage. In other words, it's designed to allow you to build your own Google Books and explore with the equivalent of an Ngram viewer and Google Earth. Now, there are problems with Paper Machines, and most people I know have struggled to make it work consistently. But it nicely builds on the back of the functionality available through Zotero and effectively illustrates what might be described as a tool for distant reading that encompasses elements of a macroscope. But what is most interesting about it is the use its creators make in seeking to shift a wider humanist and social science discussion from one scale of inquiry to another. Last month, to great fanfare, Cambridge University Press published Joe Gouldy and David Armitage's History Manifesto, which argues that once armed with a macroscope, Paper Machines in their reading, of course, historians should pursue an analysis of how big data might be used to renegotiate the role of the historian and the humanities more generally. Basically, what Gouldy and Armitage are calling for through both the manifesto and through Paper Machines is the reinvention of longue durée history writing, telling ever larger narratives about grand sweeps of historical change encompassing millennia of human experience. And to do this in pursuit of taking on the mantle of a public intellectual, able to speak with ever greater authority to power. In the process, they explicitly denigrate notions of microhistory as essentially irrelevant, and at one and the same time, celebrate the possibility of creating a macroscope while abjuring half of its purpose. Instead of essentially using the tool to look at the large scale and the small scale at the same time, they instead choose only the large scale, precisely because they see that as a route towards impact in relation to policy formation. What we see in this version of a macroscope is something that privileges only one setting on the scale between a single data point and the sum of the largest data set we can encompass. In other words, by seeking the biggest of the big stories, it's missing all the rest. Perhaps the other most eloquent advocate for a macroscope at the minute is Scott Weingart. With Sean Graham and Ian Milligan, he's writing a collective online book entitled Big Digital History, Exploring Big Data Through a Historian's Macroscope. The book is a very nice run-through of digital humanist tools, but the important text, from my perspective, is a blog post Weingart published on the 14th of September of this year, so a month and a half ago. The post was called The Moral Role of DH in a Data-Driven World, and in it, Weingart advocates a very specific vision for a macroscope, in which the largest scale of reference and view is made intelligible through the application of a formal version of network analysis. Weingart is a convincing advocate for network analysis. He's actually one of the best, the only convincing advocate for network analysis I've come across recently. And his work is performed in light of some serious and sophisticated automated measures of distance and direction, and is a long way ahead of much of the naive and unconvincing use of network visualizations current in large parts of the digital humanities. Weingart also makes a powerful case for where a limited number of digital humanities tools, primarily network analysis and topic modeling, could be developed, deployed in re-engaging the humanities with a broader social discussion. Again, like Gooley and Armitage, Weingart seek in big data a means through which the humanities can speak to power. And as with the work of Armitage and Gooley, the pressing need to turn digital humanities to political account appears to motivate a search for large-scale results that can be deployed in competition with the powerful voices of a positivistic STEM tradition. And my sense is that Weingart, Armitage, and Gooley are all essentially scanning the current range of digital tools and selectively emphasizing those that feel familiar from the more social science end of the humanities, and that having located a few of them, they're advocating we adopt them in order to secure our place at the table of conversation with STEM. In other words, there's a cultural political negotiation going on in these developments and projects that are driven by a laudable desire for relevance, but which effectively move the humanities in the direction of a more formal variety of social science. Others still are arguably doing the same kind of work, but using a different language, or at least seeking a different kind of audience. Jerome Dobson, for example, has recently begun to describe the use of geographical information systems, GIS, in historical geography as a form, again, of macroscope. This usage doesn't come freighted with the same political claims, but actually seem to me an entirely reasonable way of highlighting some of the global ambitions and sensitivity to scale that are inherent in GIS. The notion, perhaps fostered most fully by Google Earth, that you can both see the world in its entirety, as well as zoom into the smallest detail, seems at one with a data-driven macroscope. But again, the scale most geographers want to work with is large scale, patterns derived from billions of data points. And again, the siren call of GIS tends to pull humanist inquiry towards a specific form of social science. And finally, we might also look at the approach exemplified in the work of Ben Schmidt as another example of a macroscopic approach, particularly his prochronism projects. These take individual words in modern cinema and television scripts, that purport to represent past events, things like Downton Abbey and Mad Men, set at particular points in the past, and compares them to every word published in the year they are meant to represent. Building on Google Books and Google Ngrams, Schmidt is effectively mixing scales of analysis at the extremes of big data on the one hand, and all the words published in a single year, and small data on the other, a single word in a single script. In my estimation, of all the examples mentioned so far, it's only Schmidt who is actually using the functionality of a macroscope effectively, making it all the more ironic that he actually doesn't use the term. And almost uniquely in digital humanities, a field which is equally remarkable for its febrile excitement and the lack of demonstrable results, Schmidt's results have been starkly revealing. My favorite example is his analysis of the scripts of Mad Men, which illustrates that early episodes referencing the 1950s overuse language associated with the performance of masculinity. That is, words that reflect behavior, exterior descriptions of behavior. And that later episodes, located in the 1970s, overuse words reflecting the internalized emotional experience of masculinity, essentially tracing an arc from a supposed version, an extreme and overstated version of 1950s masculinity, towards an overstated and over-internalized version of 1970s masculinity. And the thing about that is that, for me anyway, it revealed perfectly the narrative arc of that series in a way that I wasn't expecting. It effectively showed me something new, which ironically in big data, in much of the digital humanities, doesn't happen all that often. Schmidt has little of the wider agenda to influence policy and politics, evident in the other work that I've talked about, but ironically, it is his work that's having some of the greatest extra academic impact via the anxiety it has created in the script writers of the shows he analyzes. And he is actually setting up a rather nice small company to provide services looking for anachronisms in modern scripts, which I think is just perfect. All of which is simply to say that playing with and implementing ideas around that macroscope is quite popular at the minute, and a direction of travel which, with caveats, I wholly support. The idea of being able to view data at a series of scales simultaneously seems to me a wholly good thing. But it also leaves me in something of a conundrum. Each of these initiatives, with the possible exception of Schmidt's work, seems to locate themselves somewhere other than the humanities I'm familiar with. And this seems to me odd. I don't get it. And I think issues of scale are absolutely central to this. Claiming to be doing big history sounds exciting, while claiming that more formal network analysis will answer the questions of humanist inquiry appears, at first sight, to create a bridge between the disciplines, allowing humanists and more data-driven parts of the social sciences to share a methodology and a conversation. In other words, with the possible exception of Schmidt's work, we seem to be unthinkingly privileging particular types of analysis, social science types of analysis, over more traditional humanist ones, and that trend is a result of, is part of that process of looking anew for big data in the humanities. And in some ways, that's absolutely fine. I've discovered to my own benefit that working with big data at scale and sharing methodologies with other disciplines is both hugely productive and hugely fun. And to the extent that big stories and new methodologies provide the justification for collaboration with researchers from a variety of disciplines, statisticians, mathematicians, and computer scientists, they are wholly positive. And yet, I find myself feeling that in the rush to define how we use these technologies, we are losing touch with what humanist scholars have traditionally done best. And where I end up is feeling in the rush to new tools and to big data, humanist scholars are forgetting what they spent much of the second half of the 20th century discovering, that language and art, cultural construction, human experience, and representation are complex things, but can be made to yield remarkable insight through close analysis. In other words, while the humanities and big data absolutely need to have a conversation, the subject of that conversation needs to change and to encompass close reading and small data. Now, the Stanford Humanities Center defines the humanities as the study of how people process and document the human experience. Since humans have been able, we have used philosophy, literature, religion, art, music, history, and language to understand and record our worlds. To me, that definition makes the humanities sound like the most unexciting, ill-defined, unsalted intellectual porridge I have ever come across. And yet, when I think about the scholarly works that have shaped my life, there is none of that kind of intellectual cream of wheat. Instead, there's a series of brilliant analyses that build from beautifully observed detail at the smallest scales. I look back to the British Marxist tradition in history, to Raphael Samuel and Edward Thompson. And what I see are closely described lives built from fragments and details made emotionally compelling by being woven into ever more precise fabrics of explanation. A gesture, a phrase, a word, an aching back, a distinctive tattoo. My dearest, remember when. The real power of work in this tradition lies in its ability to deploy emotive and powerful detail in the context of the largest of political and economic stories. And the political project that underpinned it was not to speak to power, the way we are seeking to use big data to do at the moment, but to mobilize the powerless and democratize identity and belonging. With Thompson's liquid prose, a single poor, long-dead framework knitter could effect more change than any amount of more formalistic economic history. Or I think of the work of Pierre Bourdieu, Arlette Farge, and Desserteau, and the ways in which they again use the tiny fragments of everyday life, the narratives of everyday experience, to build a compelling framework illustrating the currents and substructures of power. Or I think of Michel Foucault, who was able to turn on its head every phrase and telling line to let us see patterns in language discourses that controlled our thoughts. Foucault profoundly challenged us to escape the limits of the very technologies of communication analysis we used, and to see in every language act, every phrase and word, something of politics. And yet what we are doing now with big data is allowing ourselves to be largely held in the grip of a similar, if different, technology. By locating the use of a macroscope at the larger scale, the larger end of the scale, seeking the longue durée and the ear of policymakers, recent calls for how we choose to deploy the tools of the digital humanities appear to deny the most powerful politics of the humanities. If today we have a public dialogue that gives voice to the traditionally excluded and silenced, women and minorities of ethnicity, belief, disability, and ability, it is in no small part because we now have beautiful histories of small things rather than big tales of power. In other words, it has been the close and narrow reading of human experience that has done most to give voice to people excluded from power by class, gender, and race. Additionally, besides simply reflecting a powerful form of analysis, when I return to those older scholarly projects, I also see in them the yearning for a kind of macroscope. Each of these writers strive to locate the minuscule in the massive, the smallest gesture in its largest context, to encompass the peculiar and the eccentric in the average and the statistically significant. What I don't see in modern macroscope projects is a recognition of the power of the particular, or as William Blake would have it, to see the world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wildflower. Current iterations of the idea, with all their flashy shock and awe visualizations, probably score over older technologies of knowing in their sure grasp of data at scale. But in the process, they seem to lose the ability to refocus effectively. For all the promise of balancing large and small scales, the smaller in particular seem to have been ignored. Ever since Apollo 17 sent back its picture of Earth as a distant blue marble, our urge towards the all-inclusive, the global, the universal, has been largely irresistible. I guess my worry is that in the process, we're losing the ability to use fine detail in the ways that make the work of Thompson and Bordeaux, Foucault and Samuel so compelling. So, by way of moving towards some kind of inconclusive conclusion, I just want to suggest that if we are to use the tools of big data to capture that global image, it needs to be balanced with a view from the other end of the macroscope, along with every point in between. In part, this is just about having self-confidence as humanist scholars, and ironically, serving a specific role in the process of knowing that people in STEM are frequently not very good at. Several recent projects I was privileged to participate in involved some hugely fun work with mathematicians and information scientists exploring the changing linguistic patterns found in the Old Bailey trials, all 127 million words worth. This was, in a sense, big data looked at scale. And it was a great project. It was huge fun. What we ended up identifying was, ended up doing was coding the semantic content of every trial so that we could look at the changing pattern of language associated with violence and how that in turn mapped against charges and outcomes. And the result was a perfectly fun article, a very fun article, I thought, in the end, that was published in the spring. But after working with for a couple of years with a bunch of really brilliant people, what I gradually realized that while mathematicians do a lot of close reading of formula and algorithms, like most scientists, they're less interested than I am in the close reading of a single datum. In STEM, cleaning data is a chore. Geneticists don't read the human genome base by base, and our knowledge of the Higgs boson is based on a probability only discovered after a million rolls of the dice, with no one really looking too carefully at any single one of those rolls. In many respects, big data actually reinforces this tendency, as the assumption is that the signal will come through, despite the noise created by outliers and weirdness. If you get enough data, analyze it enough, there will be a strong enough signal that you can analyze it, and therefore you don't have to do all the work to make sure that your data set is perfect. In other words, big data supposedly lets you get away with dirty data. In contrast, humanists do read data, and do so with a sharp eye for its individual rhythms and peculiarities, its weirdness. In other words, in the rush towards big data, the longue durée and automated network analysis, towards a vision of humanist scholarship in which Bayesian probability is as significant as biblical illusion, the most urgent need seems to me to be to find the tools that allow us to do the job of close reading of all the small data that goes to make the bigger variety. And this is not a call to return to some mythical golden age of the lone scholar in a dusty archive, going gradually blind in pursuit of the banal. This is not about ignoring the digital, but a call to remember the importance of the digital tools that allow us to think small, at the same time as we're generating tools to imagine big. In relation to text, you would think this is easy enough. Easy enough to, like Ben Schmidt, test each word against its chronological bedfellows, or measure its distance from an average for its genre. When I'm reading a freighted phrase from the 1770s, for instance, like pursuit of happiness, I want to know that till the 1770s, happiness was almost exclusively used in a religious context, eternal happiness, and that its use in a secular setting would have caught in a reader's mind as odd and different and new. When we read a text from the 1770s or the 1870s or the 1970s, there is no reason for us not to actually have a vision of all the words and all the words that accompany it, which surround it, to actually know what's new in a text, what's old, what feels wrong for the date, all of that. We should be able to mark the moment when Thomas Jefferson allowed a single word to escape from one discourse and to enter another, to read that word in all its individual complexity while seeing it both close and far. And yet I know of no work designed to define the content of a discourse and map it back into inherited text. I know of no project designed with that notion in mind. In other words, and if you want to take home a single message from this talk, it is a simple call for radical contextualization. To do justice to the aspirations of a macroscope and to use it to perform the humanities effectively and politically, we need to be able to contextualize every single word and a representation of every word ever. Every gesture contextualized in the collective record of all gestures, and every brushstroke in the collective knowledge of every painting. Where is the tool and data set that lets you see how a single stroll along a boulevard compares to all the other weary footsteps, and compares in turn to all the text created along that path, or connected to that foot through nerve and brain and consciousness? Where is the tool and project that contextualizes our experience of each point on the map, every brushstroke and museum object? And it's not just about doing the same old thing, of trying to outdo Thompson as a stylist or Foucault for sheer cultural shock. My favorite tiny fragment of meaning, the kind of thing I want to find a context for, comes out of linguistics. It's entirely new to me and seems a powerful thing. And I came across it this summer, and I've been trying to figure out how I can make use of it. And it's something called voice onset timing. And it basically encompasses that breathy gap between when you open your mouth to speak and when the first sibilant emerges. This apparently changes depending on who you're speaking to, a figure of authority, a friend, a lover, 250 people in an audience. It is as if the gestures of everyday life can also be seen as encoded in the lightest breath. Different VOTs mark racial and gender interactions, insider talk and public talk. In other words, in just a couple of milliseconds of empty space, there's a new form of close reading that demands radical contextualization. And the same thing could be extended to almost anything. The mark left by a chisel, for example, certainly by definition unique, but freighted with information about the tool that made it, the wood and the forest from which it came, the stroke, the weather on the day, and the health of the craftsman. One of the great ironies of the moment is in the rush to big data, in the rush to encompass the largest scale, we're excluding 99% of the data that is there. Always looking for the average and the consistent, that signal that will allow you to use dirty data instead of looking at the particular and the single instance. And if we're going to build a few macroscopes, I just want to suggest that along with the blue marble views, we keep hold of those smallest details. And if we do so, looking ever more closely at the data itself, remembering that close reading can itself be hugely powerful, humanists will have something to bring to the table, something they do better than any other discipline. They can provide a world of small data, and more importantly, of meaning, to balance out the global and the universal, to provide counterpoint, in the particular, to the ever more banal world of the average. Thanks.